Hey, it's time for everyone's favorite content, tier list content. Have you ever wondered what features could be coming to Hearts of Iron 4 in future? We are going to go through and brainstorm every possible new feature that could be added to HOI4 and potentially say the likelihood of this feature ever getting implemented. Take my hand. Let's go on a journey of possibilities. First of all, let's talk about infantry equipment. So, we have a tank designer. You can design your own tanks. Isn't that amazing? Customization of planes. Amazing. Customization of ships. That's right. You can customize all of them. But the one thing that is missing is customizing raw infantry equipment. And to be fair, there's actually 3 things in here that could be potentially customized. Maybe even 4, actually. Let's talk about an artillery designer. Now, personally, I don't want this. But I've heard that some of you guys would think this would be cool. So you would technically have a chassis of the artillery, and then you would add potentially a wheel onto it, then you would add the barrel onto it, and then potentially you could add the ammunition. There's not really a lot of customization here, and to be fair, this would not massively enhance the basic raw game. So personally, I don't think this is Paradox is going to put lots of time into this one to try and make this a flushed out feature. So the idea behind it, depending on what barrel you put on it, would either make it an anti-tank, an anti-air, or an artillery, or potentially a rockets, to be fair. The customization possibilities through this are very minimal, and the potential difference it would make to the base game is so unbelievably small. I think there's quite a lot of vocal people who want this feature just to add the extra layer of customization. However, I just don't feel like it'll make much difference to the overall game. So I personally think an artillery designer is actually incredibly unlikely. So hand on heart, I think an artillery designer is unfortunately the lowest level of hype. Just to explain, S is probably super hype. I personally think it's very likely. D is the least likely. So we do have variants of trains in the game at the moment. We've got kind of 3 types of train. And what's really interesting is we have the regular train, we have the cheap train, which no one ever seems to research for obvious reasons. And then we have the armored train, and then we have the artillery train. So there's 4 types. I tell a total lie. The customization on this one is going to be a little bit limited. There'll be the actual chassis of the train, 2 kinds, cheap train, regular train. And then you would have the armor level. So you could potentially increase the armor of it. Increasing the armor would basically mean it'd be more immune to damage from casts and logistical strikes. And then as well, when you upgrade your anti-air, you'd have a weapon slot. And they could add a weapon slot for anti-air on it, which technically that's what the armored train is. It has an anti-air gun on it, and it also has armor. So 2 slots, a gun armament and a armor module slot. And then potentially for the Dora, basically you replace the anti-air with a gun on it. So the possibilities of customization there are kind of limited, but for the most part, to implement this into the game and to kind of enhance the novelty of trains, to kind of enhance the train experience, I suppose, which at the moment is kind of basic because you basically pick 4 types and that's it. And the second type, no one selects anyway. Personally, hand on heart, I think this is really unlikely too, because the possibilities are vastly limited. However, I actually think this is more likely than the artillery designer by the smallest amount. So I think the problem with this one is the lack of possibilities and different designs. It feels like a feature that would be implemented that would just kind of be incredibly small, so it wouldn't make a massive impact to the overall game experience. So I personally think the developers would make a big difference overall. All right, next up. This one I feel is needed because at the moment, it feels like a feature of the game that has only been looked at very briefly and has only recently had the ability to make them have better stats. Have you guys know what I'm basically going to say? Yeah, I'm going to talk about mechanized. So the way it worked in the original game, mechanized were like motorized where you couldn't customize them at all. But now in one of the latest versions, you can now add armor onto them, which I'll admit is a very small amount. You can add reliability, which feels like a redundant mechanic. You can reduce the cost, which is huge. You can make them half price, basically, but the reliability takes a hit. Half price is amazing, by the way. That's such a good feature. Oh my God, that's so good. And also you can improve the engine as well, which gives it a little bit extra speed, which is decent, but not amazing, right? The issue with mechanized, though, is it comes late game. Sometimes they can be too expensive unless you invest into making them cheaper. But overall, they are very powerful. Anyway, what am I suggesting? What am I going with this? I'm suggesting a mechanized designer. What would we go with this? So you've got lots of possibilities with this one. This one's actually quite vast. So if we compare it directly for tanks, like for like, you basically set up an armament because you could put like a mortar onto it or an anti-tank gun or you could add more machine guns onto it. So there's a lot of possibilities that stuff that would go on a tank could potentially go on a mechanized. There was mechanized that had turrets on them. There was mechanized that had anti-air guns on them. So the possibilities here are quite vast. The turret, on the other hand, is probably not something that would be very complex. But the idea of adding radios onto it, adding fuel jumps, additional machine guns, ammunition, lots of possibilities of improving the stats of your division in a remote kind of way. For instance, adding things like bringing extra equipment along that could give you an advantage in maybe forest terrain, for instance, to kind of customize of what that mechanized could actually do. Same again when it comes down to the suspension. It's either going to be a half track or a wheel suspension because they're the options. This would be good because it would reduce the cost overall, so therefore it would do what it currently already does by giving 100 XP, making it half price. You give possibilities of armor, adding extra armor onto it. Probably the actual armor overall wouldn't be here. It would just basically be like armor skirts potentially, and the engine is a big factor too because speed would make a big factor overall, and potentially you could add engine and armor onto it as well. To be fair, it is very similar to the tank designer, and I feel like these features are already in the game. The modules are already in the game, so the possibilities of this one are quite vast. And to be fair, mechanized is something that's been forgotten about for such an unbelievably large amount of time that I feel like mechanized would be an actual perfect addition to the game, even though I admit the community doesn't ask for this. This is one of those things of, I personally think this is cool, but the community personally doesn't really find it cool anyway. I personally think this is not that hype, but it's definitely more likely than some of the other possibilities. So I'm going to put Mech Designer as a B tier. This is another honorable mention that would work quite well is armored cars. And once again, another feature of the game that I just feel like has not had a lot of attention to it. But to be fair, it would kind of work in conjunction with a motorized designer and a mechanized designer. To be honest with you, I'm actually starting to think that a mechanized designer and an armored car designer would actually be the same thing. What is the difference between an armored car and a mechanized? The only difference is the mechanized is partially tracked. So technically, it's the same thing, isn't it? So to be honest with you, an armored car designer would work in conjunction with a mechanized, wouldn't it? Wow, I never even thought of that. So these would all be included as one. Oh, wow. No, to be honest with you, now I've thought about this, I feel like the armored car and the mechanized designer would work perfect in conjunction with each other. So what I'm going to say, guys, is I think the car designer and the mech designer are all going to be as one. Yeah, to be fair, an armored car, mech, and truck designer would make sense. The only issue with that is that sometimes you'd have to classify each individual one differently, wouldn't you? You'd have to specifically have like classes, what considered fully wheeled, it considered an armored car. If it's partially mechanized, it's a mechanized. If it's fully wheeled but not armored and not with a gun, it's a truck. So there would have to be like specifications for each individual category. So that could actually work. To be honest with you guys, I'm going to move that one up a category because I think that is actually becoming more and more likely to happen. The only issue with this is the technicality of what category each of them would be put into. But you know, Paradox, I love Paradox. I love Paradox because every time I think of a feature, I always think that feature will suck. But then the way they implement it is always completely different than what I imagined. Okay, the final one is infantry equipment. This would go against all the designer mechanics because technically you're no longer designing the equipment as a whole unit. You know, with an armored car or a mechanized or a tank, you're designing the whole vehicle as such. But with infantry equipment, you would be like the mod that recently got released. It would be designing what equipment that an infantry would carry along with them, which would work similar to the mod as I previously mentioned, which allows you to attach on a flamethrower, different armor types, different guns, different grenades and whatnot. You know what? I thought this feature would suck, but when I played the mod for it, I was actually blown away and it actually worked way better than I actually expected. And I was pleasantly surprised. The only downside to this that I think wouldn't work is that I feel like every player would design the same thing. So there would need to be some kind of mechanic similar to like reliability on tanks, like the low, you can make a really advanced tank with loads of stuff added to it, but that's low reliability. And it's same with the plane. The plane has the balancing mechanic of thrust and weight. It's like a mini game built into the designer. So the infantry equipment designer would need to have some kind of balancing mechanic. There's a max amount of equipment that you can carry along, and some equipment can be incredibly heavy, so therefore it would be incredibly unlikely. I think out of all the designers, I think this one isn't as likely. And I think the reason why this one isn't as likely is because I just don't think this is the way designers in HOI4 work. Designers in HOI4 is you're building the entirety of the equipment from the ground up, and you're not really specifically saying what equipment a division is carrying. I like the concept of it, However, I think the hype of this one is too low. So I'm going to put that one on a C tier. I personally think this is not going to happen. But from the mod that we've recently played, I think it actually could be a possibility. It's actually more interesting than I originally thought it could actually be. Okay, another honorable mention is a missile designer. And I think this falls into the same category as the previous ones. The potential different customization you could make with the missiles is kind of limited. I mean, what you're basically saying is the engine, which could be a rocket, the chassis of the rocket, and then the payload. And the payload could either be an explosive or it could be a nuke. The range of possibilities there are kind of limited. It kind of, in a way, it reminds me of the way it works in Millennium Dawn, because you can specifically customize and make a missile. Even though I'll admit the mechanics in Millennium Dawn are a little bit fiddly and the UI is a little bit confusing. However, that's kind of how it would work. And personally, I actually don't think it would work. So I'm not even going to talk about that one because I don't think that's ever going to be a possibility. I'm going to make a note of this one just because of how silly it is. But for the most part, I don't think we're ever going to see this in the game. All right, let's talk about some of the features that aren't designers. If you've watched any of my live streams in the past, this is something that I ask for frequently, and I feel like this would make a fundamental big change to the game. It is a Special Forces rework. I don't like the way Special Forces work. I don't like that there's like an arbitrary limit on how many you can create for them, and it's just a set amount of battalions. I feel like it could be expanded on and made a little bit more complex and more fun. So the way it would work, this is how I personally think this would work, is that if you have no Special Forces, you should get the full bonus to Special Forces attack and defense. Let's say it's a 30% attack and defense bonus. And then the more Special Forces that you build, the more that you expand on the numbers, that bonus will go down to 25%, 20%, 15%, 10%, 5%, 0%. And if you go over the number of Special Forces, you will actually start to get a penalty to Special Forces. So the idea behind it is a Special Forces are meant to be special. They're meant to be the elite. They're meant to be the most well-trained. And if you expand the pool of Special Forces too large and have a Special Forces that is just technically a standing army anyway, it no longer becomes special. The idea behind it is that therefore Special Forces actually feel worthwhile and actually feel really cool. Maybe the bonuses of Special Forces would scale. So Mountaineers would gain a 50% attack bonus and 50% defense bonus in mountains. And it would scale downwards based upon how many of them you make. Marines for rivers, amphibious, and paratroopers maybe overall organization, for instance. So they would scale based on what they're proficient at. And I suppose you could expand Special Forces for different types as well, couldn't you? You could have a Special Forces for forests. Everyone talks about like Jaeger divisions for Germany, don't they? You could specifically make an urban Special Forces as well for cracking open forts, for cracking open urban terrain, for instance, like an urban specialist Special Forces that once again would scale based on the bonus depending on how many Special Forces you would actually have. I think the idea of deploying basically a specialized division that is good at a certain type of one-trick pony style maneuver would be a really cool concept. So as you can see, the Special Forces have not had a lot of love for a very long time, because look at the bonuses. You unlock them with the first tech, then you get a soft attack and an organization bonus, then you get another org bonus. They're kind of transparent. They don't really do a great deal. It's very linear. They're not very complex. So you can see this part of the game is really basic. Later on, they did add these ones as well. Hot and cold acclimatization is cool, I suppose, but I don't know why you would ever care about that, because I think the bonuses aren't very good, but it's there. Then you've got the option between expanding the Special Forces or making them more narrow, which gives extra defense, organization, training time. Once again, hot and cold acclimatization. Some of these bonuses are just not very good. If they give a plain old attack and defense bonus to Special Forces globally, that would be really cool. But some of these bonuses are just not very exciting at all. One thing that frustrates me, these are considered like ahead of time bonuses. Why aren't I able to research these at the very start of the game and go from left to right? Why are they locked behind time periods? And why can't I use like Army XP, Navy XP, and Air XP to research these ones quicker? Because technically these are like doctrines. These shouldn't even be here. These should be actually part of like the Special Forces. So there should maybe be a Special Forces command as a part of the Army Corps. Once again, how Paradox choose to implement it, if they did, would be vastly different and probably would be a lot better than my crappy ideas as well. Special Forces. I'll admit, I might be biased here, because I personally think this would be a good change and would fundamentally change the game in a positive manner. So obviously, because I've thought about this heavily, I personally am going to rank this one incredibly highly. Because personally, hand on heart, I think this is going to be a really cool change. Let's talk about other potential reworks. This was something that Dan Lin talked about, the old lead developer for HOI4, in one of the dev diaries. He went through all the potential massive reworks that HOI4 could potentially have. And it was wonder weapons. And here it is, boys. Wonder weapons, atomic research, experimental rockets, jet engines. Now, we can brainstorm this until the cows come home. There's so many potential possibilities of how this would work. But these mechanics have not changed since the release of HOI4. And of course, nukes have been tweaked and adjusted as time has gone on, but rockets have been practically the same since the very start of the game. The idea of wonder weapons is it's meant to be late game weapons that basically decide the war. So when you get past 1945, 6, 7, the game implements features that are mad OP that could basically end the war suddenly and quickly. The idea is they're kind of like end game weapons, doomsday weapons as such. Now, nukes have been adjusted and tweaked throughout the whole development of HOI4, like increasing the amount of damage they do, changing how they affect war support and affect accessibility. But I hate to say this, but nukes are still really weak. So the question would be, how would these work? How would these be implemented in the basic game? I suppose maybe potentially this could work as like a, instead of like taking up a research slot, potentially you could work almost like an officer core system where you have like some like wonder weapon XP, and specifically you can have an extra tab that basically is atomic research, and with that comes with rockets to eventually lead to not only the nuclear bomb but also work towards a long-range cruise missile nuclear bomb. Basically, that's the basic end game weapon. 1948 to 1950, you develop a cruise missile that has a nuclear payload that could potentially land and cause a nuclear explosion. And to be fair, it kind of comes, we've gone full circle here, because this could be implemented as a rocket designer. I know I talked about this, but maybe we come back full circle here. Maybe this is a possibility as a part of a wonder weapons. Rocket 3 is a cruise missile. It is, but the idea behind it is you could put a nuclear payload onto it and it could nuclear strike a different region. The way the game mechanics work at the moment, though, is you need to get air superiority to be able to do a nuke. But I don't know, I suppose that's like a balancing mechanic, but for the most part you should be able to nuke things without needing air superiority, which is a bit kind of strange. And for instance, if you were to go for, let's say, the nuclear scientist or the rocket scientist, it would give you ticking wonder weapon XP or nuclear weapon XP, and that could be spent on an individual tab that would spend on wonder weapons. And you could, if you invest into hard water production in Norway, that would give you more of this wonder weapon XP. And then if you build more nuclear reactors, each nuclear reactor gives you more wonder weapon XP that could eventually lead to a nuclear bomb, a more powerful nuclear bomb, a cruise missile nuclear bomb, and give you possibilities of late game nuclear weapons. And for instance, whenever you research something that gives you rockets, that also will add towards nuclear weapon XP. You could potentially unlock other things as well. For instance, I don't know, maybe different rockets or maybe experimental engines, and eventually it could work towards jet engines as well. Because the way jet engines work at the moment is kind of a bit wonky, isn't it? You research the text, then you research the jet engines, and then you put them into the aircrafts. Wouldn't it be kind of cool if it was a separate XP system and jet engines could be unlocked part of that XP? I suppose this would create a system where only these would be researched super late game, because of course the cost of these weapons for using the wonder weapon XP would be incredibly high late game. So therefore you would have a limitation of how soon you could research them, just to break away from the research slots. And potentially, I think it's a possibility as well, maybe certain technologies require more than one research slot to unlock because it's such an experimental end game technology. Once again, this kind of filters into the next thing I want to talk about as well, end game reworks, which kind of work in conjunction with wonder weapons. If, for instance, if world tension gets above a certain amount, like 1,000%, there will be a call for a peace around the world because world tension has become so unbelievably high. But it's only really possible to get world tension to 1,000% based on using nuclear weapons. So therefore, people were actually more likely to negotiate in a total war situation, which kind of filters into a kind of a diplomacy rework. See, these are all end game stuff. They all kind of filter into each other. Anyway, there's my possibility. I'm going to put this one on a potential A tier. I think there's a part of me that says B tier for this one, because I feel like this is such a big fundamental change to the game that I feel Paradox might be reluctant to take advantage of it. So this is technically how it works. Map games get a lot of playtime in the early years. And then as the game progresses towards 1942, 3, 4, the percentage of players playing those years drops significantly due to late game lag. So because less players are playing late game, it's less likely the developers are going to put time into a feature that very few players will actually see. So unfortunately, as much as I love this idea, I think it's a cool concept, I think Paradox are less likely to implement this because it's going to be a feature that most players aren't even going to see. We're in a situation now that we're less likely to see late game and less likely to get those performance improvements. So that's less likely we're going to see endgame becoming something that's a part of a normal game, put it that way. So I'm going to bundle these three together. This rework is basically affecting the late game. Late game, Cold War, world tension, diplomacy. So it's 4 bundled into one, but they're all kind of intertwined. So let's talk about them piece by piece. So the late game, we know how World War II ends. Germany gets defeated. Yalta Conference, the East and West gets divided. The Cold War begins. So Cold War mechanics are all about diplomacy, all about demilitarization. And when the war ends, there needs to be mechanics in place to demilitarize the world. But then potentially a Cold War mechanic could increase the escalation. So basically we go like this. World War II begins, more countries get involved, world tension gets higher and higher and higher. We get to a certain point where it's maximum. Nukes could arrive, pushing even higher. But then eventually when Germany gets defeated, Japan gets defeated, world tension drops. So therefore war support drops. So therefore the world de-escalates militarily. There's a period between 945 and 950 where kind of world tension is at its lowest before the Soviet Union develops nuclear weapons, and then world tension starts to increase again as this becomes the Cold War East and West divide. The reason why I say diplomacy is because the Cold War isn't about total war. It's about kind of regional conflicts. And to implement a full Cold War, you would need full-blown diplomacy mechanics. And I suppose world tension would have to be reworked to implement this. The more I talk about this, to realize this is such a massive feature that very few people reach 1945 in HOI4. The vastness of this expansion is so unbelievably massive. I feel like the possibility of this one is so small. And I feel like even the devs have kind of given up on this one as well. We've had some new diplomacy mechanics as time has gone on. For instance, attaches were added in Death of Dishonor. Then we got Together for Victory, Lend-Leasing, which is kind of a diplomacy mechanic. We recently got Embargoing, which is a recent new mechanic as well, which we added in the last expansion. So there is kind of like, they're trying to implement slowly over time more diplomacy-based features, but they don't make a fundamental big difference to the overall game. Actually, you know the biggest reason they never implement this? Every focus tree only goes up to 1945. So it would basically mean every new nation would need a new focus tree, which would be such a massive fundamental change to the game. I don't think the devs are either going to be willing to do that. And honestly, hand on heart, I think these are never going to be implemented. So in HOI4, when you go for a world conquest in HOI4, you reach a certain point where you've defeated the majors and you just keep snowballing and snowballing and snowballing. There's no coalition mechanic. The rest of the world could sit on their hands while you're plowing through every nation in the world and they don't even join. There needs to be a certain point where you've generated so much world tension that the whole world declares war on you. There has to be a certain point where the whole world can't ignore you anymore and you are basically a threat to the world peace because you're going for a world conquest. Because sometimes world conquests kind of become a little bit of a grind, and it feels like the devs want you to do world conquest because is there 2 achievements about world conquests? One fascist world and also British one empire as well. So there's 2 world conquests for it. I think this is slightly more likely than an endgame rework, but I don't think it's significantly likely. It's kind of like half implementing endgame features, but not kind of doing it in a way where you put in lots of developer time into something that many players aren't going to play. So that's the reason why I've not ranked that one very high. Okay, this is something that Dan talked about once upon a time too. It was the idea of a defense rework. To put it bluntly, attacking in HOI4 is dead easy. All you do is you make a battle plan, you activate the battle plan, and the troops will automatically move forward by their own accord if they're winning. Easy, right? And then if you want to move them on the front line, it's really easy too, because they automatically move to the front line. Problem is when you're defending, it's significantly more difficult, because if you are currently getting attacked, you have to manually micro each division back piece by piece by piece. My presumption would be a defense rework would automatically micro troops back piece by piece, so it will be significantly more difficult to get encircled because your troops are automatically moving back and not getting pinned. So my presumption would be in future, a fallback line would have two benefits. One, it would allow you to automatically micro back and not have to micro individual divisions, and it also would have the abilities that you get a bonus for being on a fallback line, like maybe extra entrenchment or extra defense, kind of like how planning bonus works on the offensive. The planning bonus is an incentive to use battle plans to get an attack bonus, in this case up to a maximum of 30%. Where I feel like fallback lines don't really have an incentive to use them other than just an easy way of minimizing micro. To be fair, this is actually a reasonable request, I think, because I think for the most part, defending is something that has been forgotten about for a really long time. And I feel like anything to incentivize you to defend and hold ground instead of just completely giving up would be really good. I suppose you can implement AI features too to make fallback lines over key defensive rivers as well. I suppose the difficult part is, where would the AI decide that it's lost its front, so therefore it needs to fall back to a fallback line? I suppose it's very difficult to code that in game, you know. It's kind of a player thing to do, because a fallback line at the moment is best implemented over behind a big river or a mountain range, at the same time holding as many supply depots as possible. That's like the most preferential fallback line. But how would you code the AI to do that? I think to implement an automatic retreat feature feels relatively straightforward. Implementing a bonus for being on a fallback line feels relatively easy, but implementing the AI's ability to know when to fall back and when to defend is going to be incredibly difficult. Maybe there'd be a system where you could create front lines on rivers as arbitrary fallback lines. You know what I mean? So like, so let's say you select, so you click a fallback line, it'd be this one, then you click on a river and it basically draws a fallback line behind the river. That would be kind of cool, wouldn't it? So you would have, it would draw one for you, like the most optimal fallback line for you based upon the terrain types. That would be a cool feature, right? Maybe there could be technologies that make forts stronger. For instance, you could research advanced barbed wire, advanced minefields, and this would add extra defense to forts. That's a possibility too. Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with that idea, but the idea of having a separate button here for landmines, I think that'd be a bit silly. It would overcomplicate the game. I honestly think, hand on heart, that actually is a possibility. So I'm going to put that one as an A tier. One, Dan did say there's a possibility of this one happening at some point in the future. Of course, Dan isn't the lead developer of HOI4 anymore, so that's possibility has dropped. But overall, some of the changes that I talked about there, my ideas, could be quite easily implemented, apart from the AI one, obviously. Okay, let's talk about money. I'm sorry I keep referencing Dan Lind here. If Dan listens to this, I love you, bro. End of the day, he did reference a lot of things he would like to change. And I think initially Dan did say he would love to implement money in the game, but he didn't know how well it could be implemented based on the existing game mechanics. So it was one of those kind of, yes, I'd like to do it, but I don't know if it was possible. And in the last PDXCon, the new lead developer, he was asked in a Q&A if they're ever going to add money to HOI4. And his answer, no. No. Honestly, hand on heart, I don't think we're ever going to see a rework of trade. I don't think we're ever going to see a rework of money. It's just a big old no. Stop dreaming about it, guys. It's never happening. Okay, we could talk about an ideology rework. So this has been talked about since the very beginning of HOI4. Why don't they add an ideology for monarchies? It's been asked for so long. And to be fair, out of all the ideologies in game, probably monarchies would probably fit quite nicely into the game. It's kind of strange that we've got monarchies, non-aligned nations, anarchy, that are all classed as grey, non-aligned. I think that's kind of strange. They did talk about, I think it was brought up in like PDXCon, they did ask them about why didn't you add a monarchist? And I think his answer was also no, but it wasn't as a straight no as adding money to the game. Personally, I don't think this would make a big fundamental difference to the game, other than it would make some people in the community really happy. I suppose having a monarchy as an ideology might be a bit different because it could give the possibility of different spirits. You could have monarchist style spirits. I suppose they would just be the fascist ones, I suppose. Fascism or absolute monarchies. What's the difference, guys? Honestly, hand on heart, this is incredibly unlikely, but there's that very tiny, small, absolutely tiny possibility. So I wanted to throw that out there. Okay, I have thought of something. Let's talk about a support equipment rework. And you're probably thinking, oh, okay, this is a very strange change, Dave. Why would you talk about support equipment? Well, support equipment is very simplistic, isn't it? It's like, it's very computer game logic. Level 1 recon, level 2 recon, level 3 recon. You get what I mean? It's very computer game, simplistic, linear mechanics. And to be fair, this hasn't changed since the release of the game. This is exactly how it was when the game first came out. It was exactly... This screenshot here is exactly the same as it was. Why don't we have the possibility of a support equipment rework? Maybe there could be some complexity added to this. Maybe we have engineers, then we have the possibility of flamethrower teams, because that's what Engineer 2 technically is. Then you've basically got urban support attack divisions, and then, you know what I'm trying to say? Basically, an added layer of complexity, custom names, and a little bit of extra layer of complexity to this specific area. Would you add more companies? No. But you would basically clearly define what each of these focuses are and stop them being from just arbitrary level 1 to 4. They would have custom names. They would have maybe a path where certain ones are connected to each other. Maybe, for instance, you need to have maybe maintenance companies and logistics teams because they're kind of intertwined a little bit. Maybe they would require research off each other. Maybe they could work together, for instance. I'm not asking for buffs or stat increases. I'm just asking for reworking this screen, it being basic computer gamey 1 to 4 mechanics. You know what I mean? So in this case, I'm going to rank this one fairly low as well. To be honest with you, I don't really feel like this is a possibility either, but this has not changed since release as well. These are the doctrines you start the game with. The doctrines have just been the same from the very release. I did have a little inkling when I speak to one of the PDX employees at PDXCon that they're going to have a little look at this and maybe tweak a few of the stats in here. Will it be a full-blown rework? Possibly. I don't know. Or maybe they're just going to change a few stats and work things around. But doctrines have been exactly the same since the original release of the game. And they are, personally, in my hand, I personally feel like they're the ones that could use the biggest improvement for a potential rework. So I'm going to pop that in there as a possibility. Someone else has something in the... Oh, synthetic factories. I never liked the way synthetic factories work in Hearts of Iron 4. I feel like they were too good. They've made them more expensive as the game has progressed. I think they've had a few times where they've made them more expensive because they were too cheap. So synthetics, if you're not aware, they give you free oil and they give you free rubber. So it potentially gives you a full-blown aircraft industry, basically. And each one produces 48 fuel, but then you can increase it by 50%, 50%, 50%, 50%. And you've also got these ones too. It gives you an extra 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%. I liked the way synthetic fuel worked in Hearts of Iron 2. And in Hearts of Iron 2, I'll admit the economy system was a little bit more complex because there was lots of different resources and you had stockpiles of equipment. But you would convert coal, fuel, into oil or rubber by using synthetic refineries. However, it was incredibly expensive to do. And you could basically turn the factories on and off if you needed the resources. Potentially what they could do with synthetics is add a system where you could turn them off. Because at the moment, they just provide you with unlimited equipment, unlimited oil, unlimited fuel. And you don't really have to put much into it other than civilian production. So let's just say it's a percentage of your overall amount of synthetic oil. And it could eat your consumer goods. And if you need fuel or rubber, you can turn them on. And then they will give you that, but you would eat into your consumer goods. So it's potentially, it gives you something really great, but there is a downside to it because it is eating into your resources overall. And you could turn them off. And there could be a sliding scale. You could say 1, 25, 50%, 100% of how much oil and rubber you want from your refineries based on not eating into your consumer goods too much. And it feels like it would give an instance where Germany would feel their economy becoming more strained, potentially. So therefore, they might not want to turn the synthetics on. It's just a possibility of making synthetics just a little bit more interesting. I'll put this as an A tier. Hand on heart, though, I'm not overly optimistic. I don't think that's ever really going to happen, but it is a very small change. All right, guys, I think that's all the realms of possibilities of potential tweaks and reworks and new features that could potentially come in Hearts of Iron future. Be aware, I know you guys are going to scream it in the comments. Why are you not talking about focus trees? Focus trees is what I love. We'll save that for a completely separate video. We'll talk about potential nations that could get focus trees, potential nations that could get reworks, and potential nations that could get expanded focus trees and what they've already got. But for this video, we're just talking about features that could be implemented in the future. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want more HOI4 content, give this video a try. This is what YouTube knows that you want next. This one. Click it.